And our final discussion involves a topic currently on the minds of anyone engaged in foreign policy. As we'll hear, there are many views on the best way to approach the subject, but all agree that the issue of hostages has to be dealt with immediately if there's to be any sustainable nuclear deal. It's undeniable that as long as the Islamic Republic holds and uses hostages for material diplomatic gain, by definition, they eliminate any chance of building trust, a basic trust that is needed for any deal to succeed. The panel will be moderated by Siamak Dehqanpour, an Iranian-American journalist who has worked at the Voice of America since 2003. He owned a publishing business in Iran, and he's earned a Bachelor of Arts in Directing from the Faculty of Cinema and Theatre of the University of Arts in Tehran, and he currently is working towards an MFA in Film and Media at the American University.
Thank you, Nazanin. Hello, my name is Siamak Dehqanpour, Voice of America journalist. I'm honored to moderate the last panel of the launch event for Hostage Aid Worldwide. Just want to clarify that I'm not moderating as an official spokesperson of VOA, USAGM, or the US government. We have distinguished guests lined up for this segment. Jared Genzer, international human rights lawyer representing Siamak and Baghar Namazi, former American hostage and Washington Post opinions writer Jason Rezaian, former American hostage Barry Rosen, American Enterprise Institute fellow and former American hostage Wang Shiwe, and Richard Radcliffe, husband of Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe. Siamak, Baghar, Nazanin, Shiwe, Jason, and Barry in total, by my count, have spent 21 years in jail or under house arrest in Iran. With that, let me go to Jared Genzer. Jared, Siamak has been detained in Iran since October of 2015. His 84 years old father, Baghar, was arrested in February of 2016. What is the latest development in their cases that you can share with us? How are they doing?
Well, thank you for having me and Hostage Aid Worldwide as well. I think it's fair to say that they're having a very, very difficult time, both of them together, although they're separated specifically. Siamak Namazi has been in jail nonstop since October of 2015 in Tehran's notorious Evin prison, 5.5 years and counting. We were able to get Baghar Namazi, his 84-year-old father, out of jail about 2 years ago. But despite the fact that more than a year ago now, the Iranian Revolutionary Court commuted his sentence to time served, released his bail, and undid his travel ban, the Iranian regime has still refused to let him travel abroad for much needed medical treatment. He has a whole series of medical conditions, including an 80% blockage of the main vein to his artery. So that's main vein artery to his brain, and remains in very poor health and needs to travel abroad urgently for medical treatment. And he's been refused to do so with no basis in law whatsoever.
Jared, you recently asked President Biden to adopt a policy of zero tolerance for the unjust detention of Americans abroad. Please tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on February 16th, where, I said that President Biden should do something that no president, Republican or Democrat, has been willing to do, which is to say that whether a country is an adversary or an ally of the United States, in all such circumstances, there should be a zero tolerance policy of hostage taking. What that means is that there need to be dramatic and severe consequences immediately for any country holding American hostages, and going forward, draconian consequences that would prevent countries around the world from deciding that it is in their best interest to, in fact, detain hostages. I think the real problem with U.S. policy on Iran hostages, for example, is that we have been nothing other than consistently inconsistent with the way that we have approached the Iranian regime on hostage taking, and that has enabled Iran to continue to take hostages with total impunity, and that needs to change. The last thing I'll just say is, with respect to Iran in particular, given that there's about a dozen other Western countries that have been victimized by Iran's hostage taking as a key element of their foreign policy toolbox, if the U.S. were to take such a position on Iran in coordination and collaboration with other countries that have also been victimized, we would be in a much, much more powerful position to dramatically, enhance the consequences to Iran if it were to continue with its current policy.
We'll come back to you, Victor. Chigo, you are a post-JCPOA hostage who was arrested in August of 2016 and freed in December of 2019. Do you believe the JCPOA or any other nuclear agreement could lead to an end to Iran's hostage-taking diplomacy?
No, I don't believe any political deal that does not explicitly address Iran's hostage-taking behavior would actually stop that behavior, Iran's hostage-taking. And then I want to emphasize here that I believe that the JCPOA is partly responsible for Iran's hostage-taking spree after 2016. After the prisoner exchange of January 2016. I think the idea of a JCPOA in large part is to encourage Iran to be a part of international community and a responsible actor in the civilized world. But as we have seen, the JCPOA has failed in that regard. The Iranian regime did not change its behavior. It kept taking foreign hostages at a higher rate after the January 2016 exchange. And the Iranian regime, unfortunately, did not view the Obama administration's release of a frozen asset to Iran as a good gesture to encourage the regime to behave better. But rather, the Iranian regime took it as a ransom. It doesn't really matter what the Obama administration would say about that. What matters is that the Iranian regime explicitly said in multiple occasions that money was a ransom. It was taken as a ransom, and then they will do more hostage taking and to make America pay. And this have other consequences as well, because Iran has not taken dual nationals of European countries, and for example, also including Australia, like this scale before 2016. And in this, I think Obama's misplaced goodwill towards Iran really exacerbated Iran's bad behavior. And then now the Biden administration is talking about a return to the JCPOA. And then I think it is critical to make the American hostages, and for that matter, in my opinion, should be all foreign hostages in Iran, part of the negotiation. I don't think the Secretary of State's response to CBS reporter's question on this matter is wholly satisfactory. For him, so Secretary Blinken said, if I may paraphrase, that irregardless of the deal, these Americans need to be released. I take it as if he's saying the deal and the negotiation of the deal can happen, but at the same time, Americans and other hostages can stay in Iran's prisons, this is not really acceptable because this will just show the Iranian regime that we lack the political will to save our citizens, to stop Iran from taking foreigners hostage, and that must change. And without strong political will to force Iran to talk about the hostage and then force them to and compel them to stop this kind of behavior, backed with draconian consequences. As now we have the Levinson Act to provide a legal basis for that, then I don't think the Iranian regime will have any incentive to stop this behavior. Then today, I'm lucky enough to be home, to be in America with my family. But unfortunately, Richard is alone. And then his wife is still being jailed in Iran. And I think the matter is, unfortunately, like this. The United States must play a leadership role in containing Iran's bad behavior. Once the United States starts appeasing Iranian behavior, showing kind of an eagerness to go back to the JCPOA no matter what, then there's not very much our allies in Europe or elsewhere can do. So we, as a superpower, have to take upon that responsibility to really push for the solution of a hostage, not only for Americans, but also other dual nationals. And we have to make Iran, the Iranian perpetrators suffer and hold them responsible in a draconian way for their heinous behavior. This is, however, not to say that I'm not saying we should not make a tactical compromise. What I'm saying is behind tactical compromise that will get our beloved one back home, then there has to be measures following that to hold those perpetrators responsible. I think without either one of this, we can't succeed in solving the current hostage issues and preventing future hostage taking by the Iranian regime.
Thank you, Shiva. Let's go to Barry. Barry, you were among the first hostages taken by Iran in 1979 and were kept there for 444 days. Do you recall any agreement with the Iranian government in the past 40 years that stopped Iran from using hostages as a foreign policy tool? Barry, I guess maybe you need to unmute your mic.
Sorry, excuse me. I think the only deal that I think that that Iran had with any other country at that time was with Afghanistan, and they somehow were able to work out the situation there. But with the United States and Iran, no, there absolutely has not been any time during that period of time where they have stopped taking hostages as part of their foreign policy. To be really, to go back to those 40 years when I was first taken, I think the biggest mistake made by the United States in terms of its dealing with Iran was actually the Algiers Accord. Because in the Algiers Accord, we acceded to Iran's demand that the hostages could not be compensated for their period of hostage taking. So we acceded to something in which the Iranians saw as profitable. They could take hostages, but they would never caught in terms of compensation. And so I think that was the first real big mistake in a U.S. foreign policy. Of course, at that time, no one ever thought that an embassy would ever be taken over by any other by students or by another government which actually approved of it all. That, I think, gained Iran lots of popularity within Iran and outside of Iran for doing this.
We will come back to you, Barry. Let's go to Jason. Jason, your freedom was directly related to the JCPOA, and you were released on January of 2016 after 544 days in Event Prison Ward 2A, which we call it Band 2 How can the JCPOA put an end to Iran's hostage-taking diplomacy? And do you think sitting with this regime to negotiate is a victory for the regime? Jason, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the question, Siamak. I honestly don't think that a return to the JCPOA is the answer to putting an end to Iran's hostage-taking. As so many of the fellow speakers today on this panel and previous ones have said, this is an ongoing problem. It's not something that started yesterday. It's not something that started with Shiwe. It's not something that started with Nazanin. It's not something that started with Siamak and Bagar and myself. It started with Barry 42 years ago with 50 plus colleagues. And Iran has been doing it ever since. And we've heard today about various ways that we can address the problem and activate international and American laws, ways that we should be looking at this phenomenon. And I think it's going to continue to be a problem until the Iranian regime has a feeling that it might not be worth for them to do this anymore. And currently, we haven't figured out a formula to make it difficult for them. So I don't think it is part and parcel to whether or not we return to the JCPOA. I will say, though, that I think this notion that we can just ignore dealing with the Islamic Republic is a faulty one. Every one of us that was released through a negotiated settlement, whatever the details of those settlements were. So we have to have some sort of channel for resolving these issues. And I think it's a very dangerous game to say we won't talk to them if we're, it's difficult to say it like this, but I think everybody listening and those in government probably understand very well that our hope or demand that there won't be any negotiations till everybody's free, in all likelihood wouldn't be heeded. That's not something that seems, unfortunately, realistic. I'd like us to get to a point where we lived in a world where democratic, responsible governments like the US, like the UK, like Canada, Germany and France, all countries who currently have hostages being held in Iran, would say we're not going to deal with them or any other country who's holding our nationals until they let them go. But we're not to that point in this culture of hostage taking yet. And that's why the work that Hostage Aid Worldwide and everybody who's gathered today is so important. Because when I was taken 7 years ago, a conversation like this across continents wasn't going to happen. And I want to acknowledge the hard work of everybody that's on this panel, on the previous panels. Some of you I've gotten to know over the last few years and consider part of the extended family of hostages, unfortunate family. But here we are. And, it's time to press forward and figure out, A, how to bring everybody home safely as quickly as possible, and B, how to end this enterprise once and for all.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Richard, Nazanin has been detained in Iran since April of 2016 and is a JCPOA hostage. In 3-4 days, Nazanin should be flying home. The end of her sentences. What is the latest on her case?
Hi, and thank you for having me here. It's a really important conversation to be part of, and I'm really grateful to everything that Hostage Aid Worldwide are doing, putting this together. You're right, it's a really uncertain point for us. Nazanin was taken in April 2016 in the early days of the JCPOA, and we are now 5 years later. She comes to the end of her sentence on Sunday. It is possible she gets on a plane soon. It is possible that there's a second court case gets invoked at the last minute and she doesn't. And it's possible that nothing happens. And probably where we are now is in some way a microcosm of what many families go through, which is that uncertainty and that jeopardy that maybe it's good news, maybe it's bad news, maybe you just keep waiting. And I'm sure all the former hostages and all the families can recognize that paralysis of uncertainty that we often get kept in for a long time. I think for me, to talk a little bit about where where we are in the UK and how the UK is looking at this. Yesterday, I spoke with the British Foreign Secretary, basically to ask him what he thought was going to happen with Nazanin, what was going to happen next, what he was going to do next, and so on. And what he told me was, listen, there's the nuclear deal is up and running. We're hoping there'll be re-engagement from the US. We're hoping that there will be a thaw of relations, and that as part of that process of different equities being unfrozen and move forwards, that people will come home, and that might well be true. And you know, at a selfish level, I hope that Nazanin comes back as soon as possible and comes home as safely as possible. I hope the same for Siamak and Bakr. I hope the same for all of the Europeans that are there, some of whom are being held in horrible conditions. But I do think one thing that is important, that Hostage Aid Worldwide are doing, and many people have been involved in these conversations for a while, it is to push for recognition that there is a problem here, that diplomacy is not dealing with properly. There is a problem of state hostage taking. It needs to be called out honestly, and there needs to be mechanisms for accountability. And I think all of the conversations we've had so far about how we do that are important, because my experience of the past 5 years, but also my experience of yesterday talking to the Foreign Secretary, is that there is a reluctance publicly to honestly acknowledge what's going on and say, listen, we have states now using horse trading, using human beings to try and get leverage. And, you know, all states have got interests and complaints against each other, and this can go on in many complicated ways. I worry, if I'm honest, with where we are at the moment, that there is, as one of the speakers said before, a kind of ransom creep that grows in, and that you know, in Nazanin's case, she was taken very clearly for a pot of money that is Iran, that's a debt that was owed to Iran, that was sitting in a frozen bank account. Now we are being held in connection to a thaw on the JCPOA and re-engagement and a big complicated multilateral process. That is what it is, but I don't see that we as a community of those concerned about hostage taking have worked out enough ways to really challenge the benefits of this as a business model, and really start to impose some costs as to why this isn't actually quite a sensible practice for the Revolutionary Guard and so on. That's not a simple thing to find, but I think this is a really good conversation to start, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Jared, the US joined 58 countries in supporting Canada-sponsored declaration against arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. The only Middle Eastern countries that have signed on are Israel and Lebanon. Russia and China are also, as far as I know, not there. What does this say to you? How could this be enforced?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the Canadian statement was symbolic, and I think important as a symbol of a collective and growing global trend, speaking out more systematically against hostage taking. The problem with the statement is that, it deplores the practice of hostage taking of foreign nationals, but doesn't have any particular action items that would be required of states whose nationals would be have been taken. And of course, the key countries themselves that are involved in hostage taking are not going to sign on to such a statement. So I think it's an important symbolic step. As Jason was saying, 7 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And so I think in that sense, it was an important development, but I wouldn't make too much of it, only in that we don't, it's not a tool or an instrument that's going to change outcomes in the immediate term.
You've dealt with different countries during your work. How different is Iran with other cases?
Well, I mean, I think, Iran is different because it has a much more clear and unequivocal policy of hostage taking as a key element of its foreign policy toolbox in ways that other countries don't. But there are plenty of other countries in the world that have repeatedly engaged in hostage taking as part of their foreign policy apparatus. If you look at North Korea, you see it there. You see in Egypt, many American citizens that have been detained over time, and that's actually an ally of the United States. Obviously you see Syria, you see terrorist groups doing this as well. So unfortunately, it's a widespread phenomena, and the only way to change what countries and groups do is to just make the consequences as severe as possible. Although I am calling, of course, for a zero tolerance policy to be put in place. That doesn't mean that I don't think we have to, at least with the current crop of present-day hostages, engage in direct discussions and negotiations to secure their release. I think we have to do that. And then I would like to see us get to a place, as a number of the panelists have said, where we could threaten such serious consequences for hostage taking and do so in collaboration with other countries that the incentive structure changes, and therefore it's actually not in the interests of foreign governments to take foreign citizens hostage.
The Iranian government has been trying to justify their hostage-taking policy by saying that there are Iranians in the U.S. who are jailed because they violated U.S. sanctions law, which Iran sees as illegitimate. What do you say to them and to the families of those prisoners in the United States?
I already try to explain this to people raise this question. I think it should be understood. It should be understood like this: the United States have laws against circumventing sanction, against money laundering, and then the Iranian regime has an interest to deploy their operatives or collaborators to circumvent these sanctions and the money laundering for the regime. And then those people who engage in this kind of enterprises, they know they know the risks, and they're after the handsome financial rewards by engaging in this kind of a risky enterprises. And then very often they got caught and then tried and thrown into prison with heavy sentences. So I'm not defending every single case in the United States. That's a whole separate issue. Whether in specific process there are transparency or or certain sentences or convictions are overly harsh. I'm not disputing that. That's a separate issue. But I think it is important to understand we have laws against certain actions, and then the Iranians are knowingly violating those laws. So they were arrested, because they broke our laws. But in our cases, I believe, like myself and Nizar and Nazanin and Siamak and also Jason, we have not broken Iranian laws. If you look at the way that the closed court sessions in which we were tried, there was no evidence provided, right? Our lawyers were not given opportunity to defend us, and then there were our charges were, really trumped up, and then there's really no legal basis for them to hold us and then to sentence us. We did not break Iranian laws. They do not have the laws to prevent us. For example, in my case, conducting academic research in Iran, there is no Iranian law forbidding journalists, regular ordinary journalist activities. There are no laws in Iran forbidding ordinary business activities. So here lies the difference between those Iranians who are detained in America according to our law and the way we were detained in Iran, not according to Iranian law. So I don't think that's a good argument. Iran has no legal basis to hold these people. As the United Nations Human Rights Council Arbitrary Detention Working Group have adjudicated in many occasions that these detentions of foreign prisoners were unjust and arbitrary.
Yeah. Barry, there are former American hostages who were with you during those 444 days in Iran, who have been supportive of the nuclear deal and negotiations with Iran. How important is it for former hostages to have a unified voice? Will different perspectives undermine their cause?
I think on the whole, most of the hostages that I know of who were with me during the 444 days don't support the JCPOA. Yes, there are some, of course, and there are nuances in terms of support of the JCPOA. So I think, I don't think it's fair to say who are or who aren't. But to get back to the issue of Iranians respecting law, Iranians don't have what I would call an acceptance of what most countries would call international law. Ever since the revolution, Iran picks and chooses what it wants to accept for international law, and then says whenever it offends anything or does anything against international law, well, it doesn't apply to me. And for me, more than anything else, I feel that Iran has absolutely no respect for human rights, both domestically and internationally. And that is the biggest problem, I think, that the Western world does not really understand. And I think the United States in particular needs to go back to its basic principles of adherence to human rights violations as a primary principle of what we do in foreign affairs. So I absolutely agree that hostages need to be freed before negotiations, but given the fact that Iranians don't accept anything in terms of any sort of international law, we need to have a dual track. What we need is not to accept an agreement until there is some sort of acceptable agreement on both sides about hostages. And I think that means that Iran should be releasing all hostages, and that it should not be taking any hostages in the future. And I agree with one of the former speakers is when Iran does this again, whether it's the IRGC doing it to embarrass maybe a liberal president in Iran or not, we stop the negotiations and we stop the deal right there and then, no matter where it is, in what phase.
Jason, what if after releasing all hostages during ongoing negotiations, a new hostage is taken, as with Nazar Zaka and Siamak Namazi? Will the US, EU, China, and Russia halt the negotiations, no matter how close they are to a potential deal?
I don't think it's a what if scenario. I think we should say when they take another hostage. And no, I don't think that negotiations that are underway will be stopped. So I think for that very reason, again, I want to go back to the importance of what we're talking about here, because the culture around this issue has not been established enough and fortified enough to make it an impediment in the way that all of us would like to see it become one to Iran's hostage-taking ways. I think Barry made a really important point about Iran picking and choosing what rules and regulations internationally it adheres to. And over these decades, we've in some ways held Iran to different kind of standards than we do other countries. We've clearly placed more sanctions on Iran than on any other country. So we punished them in a lot of ways, but we've also let them get away with things that we would not let other countries get away with. Iran is kind of in its own category of countries in that way that we treat them incredibly harshly in some ways, but let them get away with murder, literally. So we have to use the levers available to us in international law and uphold the rule of law in the same ways that we would in any other country. But I think until that happens, we're not close to the end of this phenomenon. I know that it's the end of a day of panels and discussions, and we hope that we're making progress. But it's just the beginning of this struggle. It's not the end of it.
Yeah. Richard, we're very limited. Very briefly, I would like to, before we let you all go, would you tell us how has your daughter Gabriella been doing?
Yeah, no, okay. She's 6. So when you're 6, you live in the moment. She's been counting down the days for her mum to come home. So we're getting a little bit nervous about what we explain to her if she doesn't. But yeah, luckily in some ways, this is the reality she's always grown up with. There's a hard side to that, but she's not really questioning it the way she would have done if she was 8 when this started. But certainly, I hope this is over soon.
Yeah. At the end, because we're, as I said, almost over to our time, I would like to ask each of you if you have something in Farsi to say to hostages who are still held in Iran. Let's start with Jared, Jason, Barry, Richard, and Chiwei. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, I don't speak Farsi, so but I would say to them, stay strong. Know that you have not been forgotten, and that the world is doing everything it can to bring you home.
Thank you. Jason?
امیدوارم که تمام گروگان تو ایران به زودی آزاد میشن.
Barry?
همه گروگان آمریکایی یا فرنگی باید آزادی باشد.
Richard?
So I don't speak Farsi either, but I would want everyone to know that they're not alone. There are many people caring for them, and that there are lots of people outside the walls of Evin prison battling to get everyone home.
Chiwei?
آرزو دارم که همه گروگان‌های خارجی در زندان‌های ایران هر چقدر زودتر به خانواده‌های خودشون برگردن.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Barry Rosen, Jared Genzer, Richard Radcliffe, Wang Chiwei, and Jason Rezaian. Thank you very much. Nazanin, back to you.